So, welcome to Bluetooth Low Energy Unmasked, High Impact Insights from Scalable Device Hunting. If you watched the previous talk, you know a lot of context for this. A lot of this was done in parallel to a lot of Xenocova's work. I am very blessed to have interacted with this individual, and I'm very, very excited to present today. So, first, who am I? I am Matthew Remacle. I go by Remy. I'm a husband, a father, hacker, rat. You can find me on socials. I have a blog. I do quite a lot of stuff. I'm an architect at Gray Noise. We run honeypots all across the internet, large swaths of unstructured data and digging through the noise. It's kind of my forte. It doesn't deter me, and I really, really enjoy it. Along the way, I have ended up as a Bluetooth security expert because 4 years of cyan tinted toothache will kind of do that to you. Following COVID, I was inside like a lot. And there was this wonderful store near me that sold Amazon returns. They would buy it in bulk, and this truck pulls up on Saturday, and massive wooden slop troughs are filled, and all identifying shipping information is cut off the front of the box. You're not allowed to open it, but you can buy it for $5 a piece on Saturday, $4 the next day, and so on. So for weeks at a time, I'd just come back home with trash bags full of everything with an FCC logo on the back, and I didn't actually know what that was, but I know it's got radio, so this is going to be fun. Why am I doing this? Because Bluetooth is everywhere, and more everywhere than ever. What you're going to learn is what you can actually see with your typical scans is actually only a small portion of what's actually out there, and we're going to talk about the conditions in which you can actually force seeing even more than that. Why am I doing this? It's non-trivial, and I like a good challenge. I needed something to do. And an additional factor that I'm very, very passionate about after discovering sort of the impact is medical devices. There's more and more FDA-approved medical devices every single year. And for the scope of this talk, we're going to do some cool stuff with remote execution. But really, Bluetooth medical devices, there's a significant gap. Oftentimes, the risk for harm is as simple as having a larger power source than the remote device. The simplicity of connecting to a medical device and disconnecting expends energy. And for someone who depends upon an insulin pump, we see this in FDA Class 1 recalls, where this has caused real harm, and there's no way to actually push firmware updates to fix this, as Zeno just covered. So, what am I going to do about it? I cut it down into 3 core things. The domain expertise needed to work with Bluetooth and radio communications in general is hard. I didn't really know what I was doing. Measuring the impact of security and privacy implications in Bluetooth is even harder, and the cybersecurity community at large really kind of only takes action once you can kind of qualify it and quantify it. How am I going to do this? I'm going to build custom Bluetooth hardware for about $100, no soldering required, learn well-informed shortcuts for remote identification, oblique strategies for exploitation, and we're going to pop some shells. Denial of service, DOS, is dangerous again. So, 3 projects, we're going to go through it. Ratagata is the hardware, we'll explain the nature of that name. Bluid is for the analysis, that sort of remote identification, kind of qualifying and quantifying this. And the third one being Blurry, a uniform resource indicator that I'd like to design in terms of really getting that double-edged sword of scope and shoot, arming defenders and offensive attackers in terms of exploring this landscape. So I've got some links there. There's a much longer write-up and blog. All of the code that you need to do this is relevant there as well. But first, what is GATT? It is a generic attribute protocol. And underneath that, you have the attribute protocol. At a high level, this is kind of a hierarchical tree. You have the profile, you have services, they may have characteristics underneath it, and you have some operations you can perform on it. You can read it, you can write it, and you can receive notifications from it. So let's just look what's out there. So I got one of these dev kits, and I was like, cool, I'm scanning, I'm connecting, I'm doing some cool stuff. You see a lot of text there. Those are UUIDs. We'll touch on those a little bit later. And I was like, well, I want to get more. So I iterated on it, and then I shoved 2 in a box, and I was like, wow, 2 in a box gets more than 1 in a box. Who would have thought? So this is where you hit complications with radio. Here you see 3 primary center frequencies for Wi-Fi. When Wi-Fi has a channel, it's going to typically stay on that channel. But Bluetooth advertises on 3 channels, much smaller, and that's where you're going to typically see it when scanning. But after you pair to a remote device, it exchanges something called a channel map, which says, for our data communications on all of these data channels, you can find me here, 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 here. So to passively observe this stuff in aggregate, you tend to need some really expensive custom SDR hardware, maybe some FPGAs, and really I was just toying with the idea, so I was like, can we make this simpler? Here's kind of what it looks like if you have one of those SDRs. You've got the Wi-Fi channel, center frequencies, off to the left, Bluetooth advertiser channel. It's very tight, very dense. And all them dotty boys, well, that's all the stuff communicating data. So passive collection, you can get some manufacturer data, unstructured. You might get something similar to a MAC address. It might be random. You might get the name, you might not, whether or not it's connectable. And I thought that was cool, but it didn't really lend any credence to like identifying what that thing was. So I was like, what happens if we connect to it? So you walk this tree and you just kind of iterate it through it with a loop and read back the data. It's very, very active, and you get a lot more entropy in these 128-bit UUIDs. And you can kind of generate a fingerprint to match stuff against. And I was like, you know, I bet there's probably some more interesting, fun stuff to play with there. And it turns out, yeah, that's absolutely correct. But that takes a lot of time to walk through that tree and collect all that data. So how do we optimize this process? I looked at parallels, and it turns out one of my coworkers had a partner who was like, yeah, I built this thing called the Wi-Fi. It is for collecting WIGLE data for Wi-Fi. I was blessed to talk to this individual, talk about hardware design, lots of caveats. And if you look really, really closely, you'll notice that not all the pins are soldered. And this is because, due to some caveats, all of these nodes are actually communicating not over a data line, but they're using the same onboard Wi-Fi chip to communicate as a mesh. And I thought that was really interesting. So here are the parts that you can order if you want to replicate this. The last one being an omnidirectional antenna. You don't actually need that. They ship with a patch antenna. And technically, that second item was just for ease of access. The firmware itself has an HTTP API, and you can just use a laptop if you really want to. So I order all these parts, and I get them shipped to my house. My wife goes, what are you doing? And I was like, well, I'm going to solder all this stuff together. I'm going to build this really nice project. And she goes, you have an infant, and I know you. So no soldering in the house rules. And if you know me, that is completely fair. So in talking with a few friends, we were figuring out logistics. They really wanted me to do this, and I was like, you know what? Let's shoot for the lowest common denominator. Let's see how simple we can make this happen. So that's an ice cube tray I cut apart with a hacksaw, and those are screw block terminals where you just do red to red, black to black, flash the firmware, and that's quite literally it. You don't even need those screw block terminals. I was originally intending to do this with some wire caps that you can buy for 50 cents and a marine battery. So the end result is you shove it in a Tupperware container and get your data. So this is two core modules. The Radagata logger is the one that's collecting all of this. It initializes a grid saying, hey, I'm ready to go. The other stuff does nothing until it's kind of tagged in. So the Radagata collectors are initialized, and the grid becomes green. As they exceed their check-in time, items become red. Red items are prioritized for the next round of polling, and the logs are pulled back and centralized on that little screen-based device on a micro SD card. This works really, really well. You get a lot of data, and I actually received some feedback for this slide that you really need to make the colors pop because it looks like mush. And I was like, that's perfect. I actually wanted it to look like a bus seat because this is really interesting to look at when you're looking at really small pieces, but that's not the objective. When you're dealing with large swaths of unstructured data, you got to build the tools. So we're on to the next step. Blueit. Corresponding blog, you can read about it, remote identification. We're going to rely upon all the entropy in those 128-bit UUIDs, but we kind of need something to match it to. So in light of those FDA devices and how simple this is, I was like, all right, well, how bad is the best case scenario? if a vulnerability exists and you're able to identify it, ideally you have the ability to fix it. This is probably going to be through a companion smartphone app where you have internet to grab the patch and also Bluetooth to push it to the device. So what does this specific landscape look like? As you might imagine, I found out I was actually not that original when you see Zeno up here too. So we were doing a lot of this work in parallel, but I took a little bit of a different route here. A lot of these projects ingest Android applications from the Play Store or global stores, and they do full disassembly and track the entire control flow graph. And that is the correct way to do this. Now again, I'm going to describe the correct way to do this, and then I'm going to give you the shortcut. So how do you get a corpus of like every Android app in existence? Well, you reach out to some of these other stores, and after a few dead ends, one might finally reply and say, feel free to get technical. And you're like, oh, thank goodness. And then they ghost you, and that's completely understandable. If you are purely academic researcher, there's this wonderful place called AndroZoo. Highly recommend reaching out to them if you need a corpus. However, again, when I describe what I'm intending to do, as you can see, our legal team is opposed to granting access, and like completely get it, no worries. This is a completely different talk. We're going to glaze over this bit, and I probably can't give that talk anyways. So in theory, there's about 3 million apps on the Google Play Store. If you index 500,000 of those, 75,000 or so of those apps have Android Bluetooth permissions, indicating that they want to use Bluetooth. And using the built-in Android Studio tools, you can pull out those manifest items from an unknown Android app using nothing more than grep. You don't need to do full disassembly, you can just kind of grab that value. We're able to, in theory, acquire about 45,000 of them, and while you might want to fully disassemble them at a later time, you can skip that step so that it doesn't take over a month to process your corpus, and just use grep, cutting it down to less than 24 hours. Just unzip it and look for a class path, which in Android Dex bytecode is going to start with an L, so that's your little magic, and you can be like, is this using the hardware abstraction layer for Android's Bluetooth GATT interface? Yes, no, cool, keep it. This has caveats, of course. Dynamic UUID generation is not going to catch these, but we're already dealing with radio. It's a lossy data set. We're already off the beaten path. We're looking to see what we can shoot out of the air en masse and just kind of grab that. And these caveats actually aren't really that much of a pain, it turns out. So to grab out all the UUIDs, again, you don't really need to disassemble it. The const string value in Android Dex is going to start with a $sign. So if you write a regex for a UUID and then slap a $sign in front of it, again, you don't need advanced tooling, just use grep. So you can pull out all the UUIDs from all of your Android apps and build a database of them. And we have all the UUIDs from all the stuff that we've connected and iterated through. What happens when we join them up? And so that's exactly what I did. I was toying around one night and I was like, wow, this works perfectly. It tells me, the confidence, 95%, the exact location of the APK on my disk system so I can do further analysis, what the vendor might be, and the package ID. I was like, cool, this is really sweet. So we do some vulnerability analysis, and honestly, I haven't really had to make it further than this yet because this is the majority of the ecosystem. I'm like, all right, I'm going to decompile this one and do vulnerability analysis. I'm going to create a Git repo so I can track this. And then GitHub yells at me, it's like, hey, you committed a private key. And I'm like, that's not mine. And then you profit or something. As a result, I ran this through all the way to the end, did the responsible thing and disclosed this vulnerability, but it's not unique. I actually just need an example to talk about. Firewalla is a firewall product. It's roughly $1,000 for the one that I personally had in my house. And as you can see from these two vulnerabilities, you can combine these. You've got weak credentials and then you've got an authenticated command injection. That last one is actually 3-in-1. It was just easier to report that way. These are all 3 different code paths. So in that screenshot you're seeing there, I came in through SSH, which I wasn't supposed to be able to do, and then monitored that my 3 other remote code executions actually hit. There's a lot going on here. It's not unique to firewall. I'm not giving them a hard time. This is the nature of the Bluetooth landscape right now. And this is all cool and fancy, but an important thing to remember is when we talked about denial of service is dangerous, why had I never noticed that this thing in my house was doing this before when I was scanning Bluetooth this whole time? Well, my internet blipped out. And the device detected I should spin up this out-of-band management interface. So as you might imagine, there are conditions where you can force Bluetooth devices to spin up these interfaces, such as externally DDoSing an IP. You can, for some of the firewall products, we found out that the Gold Edition, the MSP Managed Edition that has a mountable server rack, might be in a secured room within your organization, is always on. You don't actually even have to trigger these conditions, so poppable from the parking lot. So in light of this, there's a lot of other conditions that you can force. And when you're scanning for Bluetooth, not only forcing the conditions of denial of service, but when you're scanning at night, at sunrise, when it's cold, when it's hot, when the power goes out, when the power comes on, very contextual. You know exactly what I was doing when that happened. I'm excited for this. I'm still at the hotel. So taking a step back, we found one thing. What is interconnected of this? You don't even need to look at the code. This is an interactive graph of all of the hierarchies of the classes. At the center there, you have the hardware abstraction layer for Android. And out on the edge, you have the vendor-specific hierarchy. And it's a lot of interconnectedness. But when you pull one of these threads, getting a CVE is easy. You want to pad your resume? Come, do it. Like, it's greenfield stuff out here. But if you want to impress people in the know, what's your force multiplier? Get 1,000. Come on, it's easy. A good example of this is Firewalla. But as recently as a week ago, one of my friends came up to me and said, hey, I was at a show in Japan, got this really cool light stick. And I said, yeah, let's take a look at it. So we disassemble the Android APK, and I find the Silicon Vendors SDK in there, Telelink. And I said, oh, I recognize this one. Your light stick shares the exact same unencrypted firmware update mechanism as this thermometer that I have this repo, the full build chain for. And if you can, across a fleet of devices, publish arbitrary firmware, that's remote code execution. As an added benefit, you can disable the ability to ever fix it. That's a problem. Now, it's not just limited to a light stick, and it's not just limited to a thermometer. Remember how we looked for that class just using grep? If you have a corpus, just go hit the whole corpus. That's your force multiplier. You're going to find 100, 1,000. Then you hit the problem of what CNAs do you talk to who actually have the capacity to even start? Well, we need to be able to talk about this. And I thought about this for a really long time. The tooling's not done. But the third part, I'm pretty settled on this. Blurry. I want to make it approachable where many attack frameworks like Nuclei, they have a templating system, a way to describe your target. And I think that's really important. But it also needs to be approachable. It needs to be that double-edged sword where, as a defender, you need to be able to easily identify if something in your vicinity might potentially be vulnerable in the exact same way that an attacker has the tools to exploit it. For those purposes, if you have Chrome installed on any machine, they've put a lot of work into building a unified API that just works with a single click. This is an internal URL in your Chrome browser. As you might see, all of those UUIDs, you can go play and look at the world around you with a single click right now. That's the onboarding. And yes, there's caveats with this, but I think making it approachable is the key thing that I care about here. Additionally, when you define this URI, it has built-in APIs to filter the scope. That's what I want to do next, and I want to join in with clues, because I think that's the correct way to do it. The Web Bluetooth API built into Chrome does not support all the features that you're going to see in clues. but it is going to make it as simple as a single click to get people interested in exploring the world around them when we need a lot more hands. Special thanks to my wife for everything, for changing the entire direction of this project, really shooting for how to make this as simple as possible. Can you do red to red, black to black? Can you do grep? Can you shoot things out of the sky? Cool, we're done. Nate, a wonderful, wonderful person who's given me critical feedback. Zinakova for organizing a lot of Bluetooth security researchers. There's a few of us, we're very passionate. And everyone in the Slot Pit crew for enduring me talking about Bluetooth on a daily basis for the past 4 years. And we're on to questions. I think I made time. Fantastic, all right. Thank you for your time.